Chapter 9 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The Hoard of the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines eat, as is well known, nothing less good than man. Their evil tower is joined to terra cognita, to the lands we know, by a bridge. Their hoard is beyond reason. Avarice has no use for it. They have a separate cellar for emeralds and a separate cellar for sapphires. They have filled a hole with gold and dig it up when they need it. And the only use that is known for their ridiculous wealth is to attract to their larder a continual supply of food. In times of famine they have even been known to scatter rubies abroad, a little trail of them to some city of man, and sure enough their larders would soon be full again. Their tower stands on the other side of that river known to Homer, Horus Okeanoi, as he calls it, which surrounds the world. And where the river is narrow and fordable, the tower was built by the Ghibellines' gluttonous sires, for they like to see burglars rowing easily to their steps. Some nourishment that common soil has not the huge trees drained there with their colossal roots, from both banks of the river. There the Ghibellines lived, and discreditably fed. Alderic, Knight of the Order of the City and the Assault, hereditary guardian of the king's peace of mind, a man not unremembered among makers of myth, pondered so long upon the Ghibellines' hoard that by now he deemed it his. Alas, that I should say of so perilous a venture, undertaken at dead of night by a valorous man, that its motive was sheer avarice. Yet upon avarice only the Ghibellines relied to keep their larders full, and once in every 100 years sent spies into the cities of men to see how avarice did. And always the spies returned again to the tower, saying that all was well. It may be thought that as the years went on and men came by fearful ends on that tower's wall, fewer and fewer would come to the Ghibellines' table. But the Ghibellines found otherwise. Not in the folly and frivolity of his youth did Alderic come to the tower, but he studied carefully for several years the manner in which burglars met their doom when they went in search of the treasure that he considered his. In every case they had entered by the door. He consulted those who gave advice on this quest. He noted every detail and cheerfully paid their fees, and determined to do nothing that they advised, for what were their clients now? No more than examples of the savoury art, and mere half-forgotten memories of a meal, and many, perhaps, no longer even that. These were the requisites for the quest that these men used to advise: a horse, a boat, mail armour, and at least 3 men-at-arms. Some said, blow the horn at the tower door. Others said, do not touch it. Alderic thus decided he would take no horse down to the river's edge. He would not row along it in a boat, and he would go alone and by way of the forest unpassable. How pass, you may say, the unpassable? This was his plan. There was a dragon he knew of, who, if peasants' prayers are heeded, deserved to die. Not alone because of the number of maidens he cruelly slew, but because he was bad for the crops. He ravaged the very land and was the bane of a dukedom. Now Alderic determined to go up against him. So he took horse and spear and pricked till he met the dragon, and the dragon came out against him, breathing bitter smoke. And to him Alderic shouted, "Hath foul dragon ever slain true knight?" And well the dragon knew that this had never been, and he hung his head and was silent, for he was glutted with blood. "Then," said the knight, If thou wouldst ever taste maiden's blood again, thou shalt be my trusty steed. And if not, by this spear there shall befall thee all that the troubadours tell of the dooms of thy breed." And the dragon did not open his ravening mouth, nor rush upon the knight breathing out fire, for well he knew the fate of those that did these things, but he consented to the terms imposed, and swore to the knight to become his trusty steed. It was on a saddle upon this dragon's back that Alderic afterwards sailed above the impassable forest, even above the tops of those measureless trees, children of wonder. But first he pondered that subtle plan of his, which was more profound than merely to avoid all that had been done before, and he commanded a blacksmith, and the blacksmith made him a pickaxe. Now there was great rejoicing at the rumour of Alderic's quest, for all folk knew that he was a cautious man, and they deemed that he would succeed and enrich the world, and they rubbed their hands in the cities at the thought of largesse, and there was joy among all men in Alderic's country, except perchance among the lenders of money, who feared they would soon be paid. And there was rejoicing also, because men hoped that when the Gibelins were robbed of their hoard, they would shatter their high-built bridge and break the golden chains that bound them to the world, and drift back, they and their tower, to the moon, from which they had come and to which they rightly belonged. There was little love for the Gibelins, though all men envied their hoard. So they all cheered that day when he mounted his dragon, as though he was already a conqueror, and what pleased them more than the good that they hoped he would do to the world was that he scattered gold as he rode away, for he would not need it, he said, if he found the Gibelins' hoard, and he would not need it more if he smoked on the Gibelins' table. When they heard that he had rejected the advice of those that gave it, some said that the knight was mad, and others said he was greater than those what gave the advice, but none appreciated the worth of his plan. He reasoned thus. For centuries men had been well advised and had gone by the cleverest way, while the Gibelins came to expect them to come by boat, and to look for them at the door whenever their larder was empty, even as a man looketh for a snipe in a marsh. But how, said Alderic, if a snipe should sit in the top of a tree, and would men find him there? Assuredly never. So Alderic decided to swim the river, and not to go by the door, but to pick his way into the tower through the stone. Moreover, it was in his mind to work below the level of the ocean, the river, as Homer knew, that girdles the world, so that as soon as he made a hole in the wall, the water should pour in, confounding the Gibelins and flooding the cellars, rumoured to be 20 feet in depth, and therein he would dive for emeralds, as a diver dives for pearls. And on the day that I tell of, he galloped away from his home, scattering largesse of gold, as I have said, and passed through many kingdoms, the dragon snapping at maidens as he went, but being unable to eat them because of the bit in his mouth, and earning no gentler reward than a spur thrust where he was softest. And so they came to the swart arboreal precipice of the unpassable forest. The dragon rose at it with a rattle of wings. Many a farmer near the edge of the world saw him up there, where yet the twilight lingered, a faint black wavering line, and mistaking him for a row of geese going inland from the ocean, went into their houses cheerily rubbing their hands, and saying that winter was coming, and that we should soon have snow. Soon even there the twilight faded away, and when they descended at the edge of the world it was night, and the moon was shining. Ocean, the ancient river, narrow and shallow there, flowed by and made no murmur. Whether the Gibberlins banqueted or whether they watched by the door, they also made no murmur, and Alderic dismounted and took his armour off, and saying one prayer to his lady, swam with his pickaxe. He did not part from his sword for fear that he meet with a Gibberlin. Landed the other side, he began to work at once, and all went well with him. Nothing put out its head from any window, and all were lighted so that nothing within could see him in the dark. The blows of his pickaxe were dulled in the deep walls. All night he worked. No sound came to molest him, and at dawn the last rock swerved and tumbled inwards, and the river poured in after. Then Alderic took a stone and went to the bottom step, and hurled the stone at the door. He heard the echoes roll into the tower. Then he ran back and dived through the hole in the wall. He was in the emerald cellar. There was no light in the lofty vault above him, but, diving through 20 feet of water, he felt the floor all rough with emeralds, and open coffers full of them. By a faint ray of the moon, he saw that the water was green with them, and easily filling a satchel, he rose again to the surface, and there were the Gibberlins, waist deep in the water, with torches in their hands. And without saying a word, or even smiling, they neatly hanged him on the outer wall, and the tale is one of those that have not a happy ending. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. How Nuth would have practised his art upon the knolls. Despite the advertisements of rival firms, it is probably that every tradesman knows that nobody in business at the present time has a position equal to that of Mr. Nuth. To those outside the magic circle of business, his name is scarcely known. He does not need to advertise. He is consummate. He is superior even to modern competition, and whatever claims they boast, his rivals know it. His terms are moderate. So much cash down when the goods are delivered, so much in blackmail afterwards. He consults your convenience. His skill may be counted upon. I have seen a shadow on a windy night move more noisily than Nuth, for Nuth is a burglar by trade. Men have been known to stay in country houses, and to send a dealer afterwards to bargain for a piece of tapestry that they saw there, some article of furniture, some picture. This is bad taste. But those whose culture is more elegant invariably send Nuth a night or two after their visit. He has a way with tapestry. You would scarcely notice that the edges had been cut. And often when I see some huge new house full of old furniture and portraits from other ages, I say to myself, these mouldering chairs, these full-length ancestors and carved mahogany are the produce of the incomparable Nuth. It may be urged against my use of the word incomparable that in the burglary business the name of Slith stands paramount and alone, and of this I am not ignorant. But Slith is a classic, and lived long ago, and knew nothing at all of modern competition. Besides which, the surprising nature of his doom has possibly cast a glamour upon Slith that exaggerates in our eyes his undoubted merits. It must not be thought that I am a friend of Nuth's. On the contrary, such politics as I have are on the side of property, and he needs no words from me, for his position is almost unique in trade, being among the very few that do not need to advertise. At the time that my story begins, Nuth lived in a roomy house in Belgrave Square. In his inimitable way, he has made friends with the caretaker. The place suited Nuth, and whenever anyone came to inspect it before purchase, the caretaker used to praise the house in the words that Nuth had suggested. "If it wasn't for the drains," she would say, "it's the finest house in London." And when they pounced on this remark and asked questions about the drains, she would answer them that the drains also were good, but not so good as the house. They did not see Nuth when they went over the rooms, but Nuth was there. Here in a neat black dress on one spring morning came an old woman whose bonnet was lined with red, asking for Mr. Nuth, and with her came her large and awkward son. Mrs. Eggins, the caretaker, glanced up the street, and then she let them in, and left them to wait in the drawing-room amongst furniture all mysterious with sheets. For a long while they waited, and then there was a smell of pipe tobacco, and there was Nuth standing quite close to them. "Lord," said the old woman whose bonnet was lined with red, "you did make me start." And then she saw by his eyes that that was not the way to speak to Mr. Nuth. And at last Nuth spoke, and very nervously the old woman explained that her son was a likely lad and had been in business already, but wanted to better himself, and she wanted Mr. Nuth to teach him a livelihood. First of all, Nuth wanted to see a business reference, and when he was shown one from a jeweller with whom he happened to be hand in glove, the upshot of it was that he agreed to take young Tonka, for this was the surname of the likely lad, and to make him his apprentice. And the old woman whose bonnet was lined with red went back to her little cottage in the country, and every evening said to her old man, "Tonka, we must fasten the shutters of a night time, for Tommy's a burglar now." The details of the likely lad's apprenticeship I do not propose to give, for those that are in the business know those details already, and those that are in other businesses care only for their own, while men of leisure who have no trade at all would fail to appreciate the gradual degrees by which Tommy Tonka came first to cross bare boards, covered with little obstacles in the dark, without making any sound, and then to go silently up creaky stairs, and then to open doors, and lastly to climb. Let it suffice that the business prospered greatly, while glowing reports of Tommy Tonka's progress were sent from time to time to the old woman, whose bonnet was lined with red, in the laborious handwriting of Nuth. Nuth had given up lessons in writing very early, for he seemed to have some prejudice against forgery, and therefore considered writing a waste of time. And then there came the transaction with Lord Castle Norman at his Surrey residence. Nuth selected a Saturday night, for it chanced that Saturday was observed as Sabbath in the family of Lord Castle Norman, and by 11 o'clock the whole house was quiet. 5 minutes before midnight, Tommy Tonka, instructed by Mr. Nuth, who waited outside, came away with one pocketful of rings and shirt studs. It was quite a light pocketful, but the jewellers in Paris could not match it without sending specially to Africa, so that Lord Castle Norman had to borrow bone shirt studs. Not even rumour whispered the name of Nuth. Were I to say that this turned his head, there were those to whom the assertion would give pain, for his associates hold that his astute judgment was unaffected by circumstance. I will say, therefore, that it spurred his genius to plan what no burglar had ever planned before. It was nothing less than to burgle the house of the Knowles, and this that abstemious man unfolded to Tonka over a cup of tea. Had Tonka not been nearly insane with pride over their recent transaction, and had he not been blinded by a veneration for Nuth, he would have, but I cry over spilt milk. He expostulated respectfully. He said he would rather not go. He said it was not fair. He allowed himself to argue, and in the end, one windy October morning, with a menace in the air, found him and Nuth drawing near to the dreadful wood. Nuth, by weighing little emeralds against pieces of common rock, had ascertained the probable weight of those house ornaments that the Knowles are believed to possess in the narrow, lofty house wherein they have dwelt from of old. They decided to steal 2 emeralds, and to carry them between them on a cloak. But if they should be too heavy, one must be dropped at once. Nuth warned young Tonka against greed, and explained that the emeralds were worth less than cheese until they were safe away from the dreadful wood. Everything had been planned, and they walked now in silence. No track led up to the sinister gloom of the trees, either of men or cattle. Not even a poacher had been there snaring elves for over 100 years. You did not trespass twice in the dells of the Knowles. And apart from the things that were done there, the trees themselves were a warning, and did not wear the wholesome look of those that we plant ourselves. The nearest village was some miles away, with the backs of all its houses turned to the wood, and without one window at all facing in that direction. They did not speak of it there, and elsewhere it is unheard of. Into this wood stepped Nuth and Tommy Tonka. They had no firearms. Tonka had asked for a pistol, but Nuth replied that the sound of a shot would bring everything down on us, and no more was said about it. Into the wood they went all day, deeper and deeper. They saw the skeleton of some early Georgian poacher nailed to a door in an oak tree. Sometimes they saw a fairy scuttle away from them. Once Tonka stepped heavily on a hard dry stick, after which they both lay still for 20 minutes. And the sunset flared full of omens through the tree trunks, and night fell, and they came by fitful starlight, as Nuth had foreseen, to that lean, high house where the Knowles so secretly dwell. All was so silent by that unvalued house that the faded courage of Tonka flickered up, but to Nuth's experienced sense it seemed too silent. And all the while there was that look in the sky that was worse than a spoken doom, so that Nuth, as is often the case when men are in doubt, had leisure to fear the worst. Nevertheless, he did not abandon the business, but sent the likely lad with the instruments of his trade by means of the ladder to the old green casement. And the moment that Tonka touched the withered boards, the silence that, though ominous, was earthly, became unearthly like the touch of a ghoul. And Tonka heard his breath offending against that silence, and his heart was like mad drums in a night attack, and a string of one of his sandals went tap on a rung of a ladder, and the leaves of the forest were mute, and the breeze of the night was still, and Tonka prayed that a mouse or a mole might make any noise at all. But not a creature stirred, even Nuth was still. And then and there, while yet he was undiscovered, the likely lad made up his mind, as he should have done long before, to leave those colossal emeralds where they were, and have nothing further to do with the lean, high house of the Knowles, but to quit this sinister wood in the nick of time, and retire from business at once and buy a place in the country. Then he descended softly and beckoned to Nuth. But the Knowles had watched him through knavish holes that they bore in trunks of the trees, and the unearthly silence gave away, as it were with a grace, to the rapid screams of Tonka as they picked him up from behind, screams that came faster and faster until they were incoherent. And where they took him it is not good to ask, and what they did with him I shall not say. Nuth looked on for a while from the corner of the house with a mild surprise on his face as he rubbed his chin, for the trick of the holes in the trees was new to him. Then he stole nimbly away through the dreadful wood. And did they catch Nuth, you ask me, gentle reader? Oh no, my child, for such a question is childish. Nobody ever catches Nuth. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. How one came, as was foretold, to the city of Never. The child that played about the terraces and gardens in sight of the Surrey hills never knew that it was he that should come to the ultimate city, never knew that he should see the underpits, the barbicans and the holy minarets of the mightiest city known. I think of him now as a child with a little red watering can, going about the gardens on a summer's day that lit the warm south country, his imagination delighted with all tales of quite little adventures, and all the while there was reserved for him that feat at which men wonder. Looking in other directions, away from the Surrey hills, through all his infancy, he saw that precipice that, wall above wall and mountain above mountain, stands at the edge of the world, and in perpetual twilight, alone with the moon and the sun, holds up the inconceivable city of Never. To tread its streets he was destined, prophecy knew it. He had the magic halter, and a worn old rope it was. An old wayfaring woman had given it to him. It had the power to hold any animal whose race had never known captivity, such as the unicorn, the hippogriff Pegasus, dragons and wyverns. But with a lion, giraffe, camel or horse, it was useless. How often we have seen that city of Never, that marvel of the nations, not when it is night in the world, and we can see no further than the stars, not when the sun is shining where we dwell, dazzling our eyes, but when the sun has set on some stormy days, all at once repentant at evening, and those glittering cliffs reveal themselves, which we almost take to be clouds, and it is twilight with us as it is for ever with them. Then on their gleaming summits we see those golden domes that overpeer the edges of the world, and seem to dance with dignity and calm in that gentle light of evening that is wonder's native haunt. Then does the city of Never, unvisited and afar, look long at her sister, the world. It had been prophesied that he should come there. They knew it when the pebbles were being made, and before the isles of coral were given unto the sea. And thus the prophecy came into fulfilment and passed into history, and so at length to oblivion, out of which I drag it as it goes floating by, into which I shall one day tumble. The hippogriffs dance before dawn in the upper air. Long before sunrise flashes upon our lawns, they go to glitter in light that has not yet come to the world. And as the dawn works up from the ragged hills, and the stars feel it, they go slanting earthwards, till sunlight touches the tops of the tallest trees, and the hippogriffs alight with a rattle of quills, and fold their wings and gallop and gambol away, till they come to some prosperous, wealthy, detestable town, and they leap at once from the fields and soar away from the sight of it, pursued by the horrible smoke of it, until they come again to the pure blue air. He whom prophecy had named from of old to come to the city of Never went down one midnight with his magic halter to a lakeside where the hippogriffs alighted at dawn, for the turf was soft there, and they could gallop far before they came to a town, and there he waited, hidden near their hoof marks. And the stars paled a little and grew indistinct, but there was no other sign as yet of the dawn, when there appeared far up in the deeps of the night 2 little saffron specks, then 4 and 5. It was the hippogriffs dancing and twirling around in the sun. Another flock joined them. There were 12 of them now. They danced there, flashing their colours back to the sun. They descended in wide curves slowly, trees down on earth revealed against the sky, jet black, each delicate twig. A star disappeared from a cluster, now another, and dawn came on like music, like a new song. Ducks shot by to the lake from still dark fields of corn, far voices uttered. A colour grew upon water, and still the hippogriffs gloried in the light, revelling up in the sky. But when pigeons stirred on the branches, and the first small bird was abroad, and little coots from the rushes ventured to peer about, then there came down on a sudden with a thunder of feathers the hippogriffs, and, as they landed from their celestial heights, all bathed with the day's first sunlight, the man whose destiny it was, as from old, to come to the city of Never, sprang up and caught the last with the magic halter. The man whose destiny it was, as from of old, to come to the city of Never, sprang up and caught the last with the magic halter. It plunged, but could not escape it, for the hippogriffs are of the uncaptured races, and magic has power over the magical. So the man mounted it, and it soared again for the heights whence it had come, as a wounded beast goes home. But when they came to the heights, that venturous rider saw huge and fair to the left of him the destined city of Never, and he beheld the towers of Lel and Lek, Nearib and Akathuma, and the cliffs of Tolden Arbor are glistening in the twilight like an alabaster statue of the evening. Towards them he wrenched the halter, towards Tolden Arbor and the underpits. The wings of the hippogriff roared as the halter turned him. Of the underpits, who shall tell? Their mystery is secret. It is held by some that they are the sources of night, and that darkness pours from them at evening upon the world, while others hint that knowledge of these might undo our civilization. There watched him ceaselessly from the underpits those eyes whose duty it is, from further within and deeper. The bats that dwell there arose when they saw the surprise in the eyes. The sentinels on the bulwarks beheld that stream of bats, and lifted up their spears as it were for war. Nevertheless, when they perceived that that war for which they watched was not now come upon them, they lowered their spears and suffered him to enter. And he passed, whirring through the earthward gateway. Even so he came, as foretold, to the city of Never, perched upon Tolden Arbor, and saw late twilight on those pinnacles that know no other light. All the domes were of copper, but the spires on their summits were gold. Little steps of onyx ran all this way and that, with cobbled agates were its streets a glory. Through small square panes of rose quartz the citizens looked from their houses. To them, as they looked abroad, the world far off seemed happy. Clad though that city was in one robe always, in twilight, yet was its beauty worthy of even so lovely a wonder. City and twilight were both peerless, but for each other. Built of a stone unknown in the world we tread, were its bastions, quarried we know not where, but called by the gnomes abics. It so flashed back to the twilight its glories, colour for colour, that none can say of them where their boundary is, and which the eternal twilight, and which the city of Never. They are the twin-born children, the fairest daughters of wonder. Time had been there, but not to work destruction. he had turned to a fair, pale green the domes that were made of copper. The rest he had left untouched. Even he, the destroyer of cities, by what bribe I know not, averted. Nevertheless they often wept in Never, for change and passing away, mourning catastrophes in other worlds, and they built temples sometimes to ruined stars that had fallen flaming down from the Milky Way, giving them worship still when by us long since forgotten. Other temples they have, who knows to what divinities? And he that was destined alone of men to come to the city of Never was well content to behold it, as he trotted down its agate street, with the wings of his hippogriff furled, seeing at either side of him marvel on marvel, of which even China is ignorant. Then, as he neared the city's further rampart, by which no inhabitant stirred, and looked in a direction to which no houses faced, with any rose-pink windows, he suddenly saw, far off, dwarfing the mountains, an even greater city. Whether that city was built upon the twilight, or whether it rose from the coasts of some other world, he did not know. He saw it dominate the city of Never, and strove to reach it. But at this unmeasured home of unknown colossi, the hippogriff shied frantically, and neither the magic halter nor anything that he did could make the monster face it. At last, from the city of Never's lonely outskirts, where no inhabitants walked, the rider turned slowly earthward. He knew now why all the windows faced this way. The denizens of the twilight gazed at the world, and not at a greater than them. Then, from the last step of the earthward stairway that lead past the underpits and down the glittering face of the Tolden Arbor, down from the overshadowed glories of the gold-tipped city of Never, and out of perpetual twilight, swooped the man on his winged monster. The wind that slept at the time leapt up like a dog at their onrush. It uttered a cry and ran past them. Down on the world it was morning. Night was roaming away with his cloak trailed behind him. White mists turned over and over as he went. The orb was grey, but it glittered. Lights blinked surprisingly in early windows. Forth over wet, dim fields went cows from their houses. Even in this hour touched the fields again the feet of the hippogriff. And the moment that the man dismounted and took off his magic halter, the hippogriff flew slanting away with a whir, going back to some airy dancing place of his people. And he that surmounted glittering Tolden Arbor, and came alone of men to the city of Never, has his name and his fame among nations. But he and the people of that twilit city well know two things, unguessed by other men: that there is another city fairer than theirs, and he a deed unaccomplished. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The coronation of Mr. Thomas Shapp. It was the occupation of Mr. Thomas Shapp to persuade customers that the goods were genuine and of an excellent quality, and that as regards the price their unspoken will was consulted. And in order to carry on this occupation, he went by train very early every morning, some few miles nearer to the city from the suburb in which he slept. This was the use to which he put his life. From the moment when he first perceived, not as one reads a thing in a book, but as truths are revealed to one's instinct, the very beastliness of his occupation, and of the house that he slept in, its shape, make, and pretensions, and even of the clothes that he wore. From that moment he withdrew his dreams from it, his fancies, his ambitions, everything in fact, except that ponderable Mr. Shapp that dressed in a frock coat, bought tickets and handled money, and could in turn be handled by the statistician. The priest's share in Mr. Shap, the share of the poet, never caught the early train to the city at all. He used to take little flights of fancy at first, dwelt all day in his dreamy way on fields and rivers, lying in the sunlight where it strikes the world more brilliantly further south. And then he began to imagine butterflies there. After that, silken people in the temples they built to their gods. They noticed that he was silent and even absent at times, but they found no fault with his behaviour with customers, to whom he remained as plausible as of old. So he dreamed for a year, and his fancy gained strength as he dreamed. He still read halfpenny papers in the train, still discussed the passing day's ephemeral topic, still voted at elections, though he no longer did these things with the whole Shap. His soul was no longer in them. He had had a pleasant year. His imagination was all new to him still, and it had often discovered beautiful things away where it went, southeast at the edge of the twilight. And he had a matter-of-fact and logical mind, so that he often said, "Why should I pay my twopence at the Electric Theatre when I can see all sorts of things quite easily without?" Whatever he did was logical before anything else, and those that knew him always spoke of Shap as a sound, sane, level-headed man. On far the most important day of his life, he went as usual to town by the early train to sell plausible articles to customers, while the spiritual Shap roamed off to fanciful lands. As he walked from the station, dreamy but wide awake, it suddenly struck him that the real Shap was not the one walking to business in black and ugly clothes, but he who roamed along a jungle's edge near the ramparts of an olden eastern city that rose up sheer from the sand, and against which the desert lapped with one eternal wave. He used to fancy the name of that city was Lakar. After all, the fancy is as real as the body, he said with perfect logic. It was a dangerous theory. For that other life that he led, he realized, as in business, the importance and value of method. He did not let his fancy roam too far until it perfectly knew its first surroundings. Particularly, he avoided the jungle. He was not afraid to meet a tiger there. After all, it was not real. But stranger things might crouch there. Slowly he built up Lakar, rampart by rampart, towers for archers, gateway of brass and all. And then one day he argued, and quite rightly, that all the silk-clad people in its streets, their camels, their wares that came from Inkustan, the city itself, were all the things of his will. And then he made himself king. He smiled after that when people did not raise their hats to him in the street as he walked from the station to business. But he was sufficiently practical to recognize that it was better not to talk of this to those that only knew him as Mr. Shap. Now that he was king in the city of Lakar, and in all the desert that lay to the east and north, he sent his fancy to wander further afield. He took the regiments of his camel guards and went jingling out of Lakar with little silver bells under the camels' chins, and came to other cities far off on the yellow sand, with clear white walls and towers, uplifting themselves in the sun. Through their gates he passed with his 3 silken regiments, the light blue regiment of the camel guards being upon his right, and the green regiment riding at his left, the lilac regiment going on before. When he had gone through the streets of any city, and observed the ways of its people, and had seen the way that the sunlight struck its towers, he would proclaim himself king there, and then ride on in fancy. So he passed from city to city, and from land to land. Clear-sighted though Mr. Shap was, I think he overlooked the lust of aggrandizement to which kings have so often been victims. And so it was that when the first few cities had opened their gleaming gates, and he saw peoples prostrate before his camel, and spearmen cheering along countless balconies, and priests come out to do him reverence, he that had never had even the lowliest authority in the familiar world became unwisely insatiate. He let his fancy ride at inordinate speed. He forsook method. Scarce was he king of a land, but he yearned to extend his borders. So he journeyed deeper and deeper into the wholly unknown. The concentration that he gave to this inordinate progress through countries of which history is ignorant, and cities so fantastic in their bulwarks that, though their inhabitants were human, yet the foe that they feared seemed something less or more. The amazement with which he beheld gates and towers, unknown even to art, and furtive people thronging intricate ways to acclaim him as their sovereign, all these things began to affect his capacity for business. He knew as well as any that his fancy could not rule these beautiful lands unless that other Shap, however unimportant, were well sheltered and fed. And shelter and food meant money, and money, business. His was more like the mistake of some gambler with cunning schemes who overlooks human greed. One day his fancy, riding in the morning, came to a city gorgeous as the sunrise, in whose opalescent wall were gates of gold, so huge that a river poured between the bars, floating in, when the gates were opened, large galleons under sail. Thence there came dancing out a company with instruments, and made a melody all around the wall. That morning Mr. Shap, the bodily Shap in London, forgot the train to town. Until a year ago he had never imagined at all. It is not to be wondered at that all these things now newly seen by his fancy should play tricks at first with the memory of even so sane a man. He gave up reading the papers altogether. He lost all interest in politics. He cared less and less for things that were going on around him. This unfortunate missing of the morning train even occurred again, and the firm spoke to him severely about it. But he had his consolation. Were not Arathrian and Argan Zerith and all the level coasts of Ura his? And even as the firm found fault with him, his fancy watched the yaks on weary journeys, slow specks against the snowfields bringing tribute, and saw the green eyes of the mountain men who had looked at him strangely in the city of Nith when he had entered it by the desert door. Yet his logic did not forsake him. He knew well that his strange subjects did not exist, but he was prouder of having created them with his brain than merely of ruling them only. Thus, in his pride, he felt himself something more great than a king. He did not dare to think what. He went into the temple of the city of Zora and stood some time there alone. All the priests kneeled to him when he came away. He cared less and less for the things we care about, for the affairs of Shap, the business man in London. He began to despise the man with royal contempt. One day when he sat in Saula, the city of the Thulls, throned on one amethyst, he decided, and it was proclaimed on the moment by silver trumpets all along the land, that he would be crowned as king over all the lands of wonder. By that old temple where the Thulls were worshipped year in, year out, for over 1,000 years, they pitched pavilions in the open air. The trees that blew there threw out radiant scents unknown in any countries that know the map. The stars blazed fiercely for that famous occasion. A fountain hurled up, clattering, ceaselessly into the air, armfuls on armfuls of diamonds. A deep hush waited for the golden trumpets. The holy coronation night was come. At the top of those old worn steps, going down we know not whither, stood the king in the emerald and amethyst cloak, the ancient garb of the Thulls. Beside him lay that Sphinx that for the last few weeks had advised him in his affairs. Slowly, with music when the trumpets sounded, came up towards him from we know not where 120 archbishops, 20 angels and 2 archangels with that terrific crown, the diadem of the Thulls. They knew as they came up to him that promotion awaited them all because of this night's work. Silent, majestic, the king awaited them. The doctors downstairs were sitting over their supper. The warders softly slipped from room to room. And when in that cosy dormitory of Hanwell they saw the king still standing erect and royal, his face resolute, they came up to him and addressed him. "Go to bed," they said, "pretty bed." So he lay down and soon was fast asleep. The great day was over. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. Chubu and Sheemish. It was the custom on Tuesdays in the temple of Chubu for the priests to enter at evening and chant, "There is none but Chubu." And all the people rejoiced and cried out, "There is none but Chubu." And honey was offered to Chubu, and maize and fat. Thus was he magnified. Chubu was an idol of some antiquity, as may be seen from the colour of the wood. He had been carved out of mahogany, and after he was carved he had been polished. Then they had set him up on the diorite pedestal, with the brazier in front of it for burning spices, and the flat gold plates for fat. Thus they worshipped Chubu. He must have been there for over 100 years, when one day the priests came in with another idol into the temple of Chubu, and set it up on a pedestal near Chubu's, and sang, "There is also Sheemish." And all the people rejoiced and cried out, "There is also Sheemish." Sheemish was palpably a modern idol, and although the wood was stained with a dark red dye, you could see that he had only just been carved. And honey was offered to Sheemish as well as Chubu, and also maize and fat. The fury of Chubu knew no time limit. He was furious all that night, and the next day he was furious still. The situation called for immediate miracles. To devastate the city with a pestilence and kill all his priests was scarcely within his power. Therefore, he wisely concentrated such divine powers as he had in commanding a little earthquake. "Thus," thought Chubu, "will I reassert myself as the only god, and men shall spit upon Sheemish." Chubu willed it, and still no earthquake came, when suddenly he was aware that the hated Sheemish was daring to attempt a miracle too. He ceased to busy himself about the earthquake and listened, or shall I say felt, for what Sheemish was thinking. For gods are aware of what passes in the mind by a sense that is other than any of our 5. Sheemish was trying to make an earthquake too. The new god's motive was probably to assert himself. I doubt if Chubu understood or cared for his motive. It was sufficient for an idol already aflame with jealousy that his detestable rival was on the verge of a miracle. All the power of Chubu veered round at once and set dead against an earthquake, even a little one. It was thus in the temple of Chubu for some time, and then no earthquake came. To be a god and to fail to achieve a miracle is a despairing sensation. It is as though among men one should determine upon a hearty sneeze, and as though no sneeze should come. It is as though one should try to swim in heavy boots, or remember a name that is utterly forgotten. All these pains were Sheemish's. And upon Tuesday the priests came in, and the people, and they did worship Chubu and offered fat to him, saying, "O Chubu, who made everything." And then the priest sang, "There is also Sheemish." And Chubu was put to shame and spake not for 3 days. Now there were holy birds in the temple of Chubu, and when the 3rd day was come and the night thereof, it was as it were revealed to the mind of Chubu that there was dirt upon the head of Sheemish. And Chubu spake unto Sheemish as speak the gods, moving no lips nor yet disturbing the silence, saying, "There is dirt upon thy head, O Sheemish." All night long he muttered again and again, "There is dirt upon Sheemish's head." And when it was dawn and voices were heard far off, Chubu became exultant with earth's awakening things, and cried out till the sun was high, "Dirt, dirt, dirt upon the head of Sheemish." And at noon he said, "So Sheemish would be a god." Thus was Sheemish confounded. And with Tuesday one came and washed his head with rose water, and he was worshipped again, when they sang, "There is also Sheemish." And yet was Chubu content, for he said, "The head of Sheemish has been defiled." And again, "His head was defiled. It is enough." And one evening, lo, there was dirt on the head of Chubu also, and the thing was perceived of Sheemish. It is not with the gods as it is with men. We are angry one with another and turn from our anger again, but the wrath of the gods is enduring. Chubu remembered and Sheemish did not forget. They spake as we do not speak, in silence, yet heard of each other, nor were their thoughts as our thoughts. We should not judge them merely by human standards. All night long they spake, and all night said these words only, "Dirty Chubu, dirty Sheemish, dirty Chubu, dirty Sheemish," all night long. Their wrath had not tired at dawn, and neither had wearied of his accusation. And gradually Chubu came to realize that he was nothing more than the equal of Sheemish. All gods are jealous, but this equality with the upstart Sheemish, a thing of painted wood 100 years newer than Chubu, and this worship given to Sheemish in Chubu's own temple, were particularly bitter. Chubu was jealous, even for a god, and when Tuesday came again, the 3rd day of Sheemish's worship, Chubu could bear it no longer. He felt that his anger must be revealed at all costs, and he returned with all the vehemence of his will to achieving a little earthquake. The worshippers had just gone from his temple when Chubu settled his will to attain this miracle. Now and then his meditations were disturbed by that now familiar dictum, "Dirty Chubu." But Chubu willed ferociously, not even stopping to say what he longed to say, and had already said 900 times, and presently even these interruptions ceased. They ceased because Sheemish had returned to a project that he had never definitely abandoned, the desire to assert himself and exalt himself over Chubu by performing a miracle. And the district being volcanic, he had chosen a little earthquake as the miracle most easily accomplished by a small god. Now an earthquake that is commanded by 2 gods has double the chance of fulfilment than when it is willed by one, and an incalculably greater chance than when 2 gods are pulling different ways, as, to take the case of older and greater gods, when the sun and the moon pull in the same direction, we have the biggest tides. Chubu knew nothing of the theory of tides, and was too much occupied in his miracle to notice what Sheemish was doing. And suddenly the miracle was an accomplished thing. It was a very local earthquake, for there are other gods than Chubu or even Sheemish, and it was only a little one as the gods had willed. But it loosened some monoliths in a colonnade that supported one side of the temple, and the whole of one wall fell in. And the low huts of the people of that city were shaken a little, and some of their doors were jammed so that they would not open. It was enough, and for a moment it seemed that it was all. Neither Chubu nor Sheemish commanded that there should be more, but they had set in motion an old law, older than Chubu, the law of gravity, that colonnade had held back for 100 years, and the temple of Chubu quivered, and then stood still, swayed once, and was overthrown on the heads of Chubu and Sheemish. No one rebuilt it, for nobody dared to near such terrible gods. Some said that Chubu wrought the miracle, but some said Sheemish. And thereof schism was born. The weakly amiable, alarmed by the bitterness of rival sects, sought compromise and said that both had wrought it. But no one guessed the truth, that the thing was done in rivalry. And a saying arose, and both sects held this belief in common: those who toucheth Chubu shall die, or whoso looketh upon Sheemish. That is how Chubu came into my possession when I travelled once beyond the hills of Ting. I found him in the fallen temple of Chubu, with his hands and toes sticking up out of the rubbish, lying upon his back, and in that attitude, just as I found him, I keep him to this day on my mantelpiece, as he is less liable to be upset that way. Sheemish was broken, so I left him where he was. And there is something so helpless about Chubu with his fat hands stuck up in the air that sometimes I am moved out of compassion to bow down to him and pray, saying, "O Chubu, thou that made everything, help thy servant." Chubu cannot do much, though once I am sure that at a game of bridge he sent me the ace of trumps after I had not held a card worth having for the whole of the evening. And chance alone could have done as much as that for me. But I do not tell this to Chubu. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The Wonderful Window. The old man in the oriental-looking robe was being moved on by the police, and it was this that attracted to him and the parcel under his arm the attention of Mr. Sladen, whose livelihood was earned in the emporium of Messrs. Mergin and Chater, that is to say, in their establishment. Mr. Sladen had the reputation of being the silliest young man in business. A touch of romance, a mere suggestion of it, would send his eyes gazing away as though the walls of the emporium were of gossamer and London itself a myth, instead of attending to customers. Merely the fact that the dirty piece of paper that wrapped the old man's parcel was covered with Arabic writing was enough to give Mr. Sladen the idea of romance, and he followed until the little crowd fell off, and the stranger stopped by the curb and unwrapped his parcel and prepared to sell the thing that was inside it. It was a little window in old wood with small panes set in lead. It was not much more than a foot in breadth and was under 2 feet long. Mr. Sladen had never before seen a window sold in the street, so he asked the price of it. "Its price is all you possess," said the old man. "Where did you get it?" said Mr. Sladen, for it was a strange window. "I gave all that I possessed for it in the streets of Baghdad." "Did you possess much?" said Mr. Sladen. "I had all that I wanted," he said, "except this window." "It must be a good window," said the young man. "It is a magical window," said the old one. "I have only 10 shillings on me, but I have 15 and 6 at home." The old man thought for a while. "Then 25 and 6pence is the price of the window," he said. It was only when the bargain was completed, and the 10 shillings paid, and the strange old man was coming for his 15 and 6, and to fit the magical window into his only room, that it occurred to Mr. Sladen's mind that he did not want a window. And then they were at the door of the house in which he rented a room, and it seemed too late to explain. The stranger demanded privacy when he fitted up the window, so Mr. Sladen remained outside the door at the top of a little flight of creaky stairs. He heard no sound of hammering. And presently the strange old man came out with his faded yellow robe and his great beard and his eyes on far off places. "It is finished," he said, and he and the young man parted. And whether he remained a spot of colour and an anachronism in London, or whether he ever came again to Bagdad, and what dark hands kept on the circulation of his 25 and 6, Mr. Sladen never knew. Mr. Sladen entered the bare-boarded room in which he slept, and spent all his indoor hours between closing time and the hour at which Messrs. Mergin and Chater commenced. To the penates of so dingy a room, his neat frock coat must have been a continual wonder. Mr. Sladen took it off and folded it carefully, and there was the old man's window, rather high up in the wall. There had been no window in that wall hitherto, nor any ornament at all, but a small cupboard. So when Mr. Sladen had put his frock coat safely away, he glanced through his new window. It was where his cupboard had been in which he kept his tea things. They were all standing on the table now. When Mr. Sladen glanced through his new window, it was late in a summer's evening. The butterflies some while ago would have closed their wings, though the bat would scarcely yet be drifting abroad. But this was in London. The shops were shut, and street lamps not yet lighted. Mr. Sladen rubbed his eyes, then rubbed the window, and still he saw a sky of blazing blue, and far, far down beneath him, so that no sound came up from it or smoke of chimneys, a mediaeval city set with towers, brown roofs and cobbled streets, and then white walls and buttresses, and beyond them bright green fields and tiny streams. On the towers archers lolled, and along the walls were pikemen, and now and then a waggon went down some old world street and lumbered through the gateway and out to the country. And now and then a waggon drew up to the city from the mist that was rolling with evening over the fields. Sometimes folks put their heads out of lattice windows. Sometimes some idle troubadour seemed to sing, and nobody hurried or troubled about anything. Airy and dizzy though the distance was, for Mr. Sladen seemed higher above the city than any cathedral gargoyle, yet one clear detail he obtained as a clue. The banners floating from every tower over the idle arches had little golden dragons all over a pure white field. He heard motor buses roar by his other window. He heard the newsboys howling. Mr. Sladen grew dreamier than ever after that on the premises in the establishment of Messrs. Mergin and Chater. But in one matter he was wise and wakeful. He made continuous and careful inquiries about the golden dragons on a white flag, and talked to no one of his wonderful window. He came to know the flags of every king in Europe. He even dabbled in history. He made inquiries at shops that understood heraldry, but nowhere could he learn any trace of little dragons, or on a field argent. And when it seemed that for him alone those dragons had fluttered, he came to love them as an exile in some desert might love the lilies of his home, or as a sick man might love swallows when he cannot easily live to another spring. As soon as Messrs. Mergin and Chaytor closed, Mr. Sladden used to go back to his dingy room and gaze through the wonderful window until it grew dark in the city, and the guard would go with a lantern round the ramparts, and the night came up like velvet, full of strange stars. Another clue he tried to obtain one night by jotting down the shapes of the constellations. But this led him no further, for they were unlike any that shone upon either hemisphere. Each day as soon as he woke he went first to the wonderful window, and there was the city, diminutive in the distance, all shining in the morning, and the golden dragons dancing in the sun, and the archers stretching themselves or swinging their arms on the tops of the windy towers. The window would not open, so that he never heard the songs that the troubadours sang down there beneath the gilded balconies. He did not even hear the belfries' chimes, though he saw the jackdaws routed every hour from their homes. And the first thing that he always did was to cast his eye round all the little towers that rose up from the ramparts, to see that the little golden dragons were flying there on their flags. And when he saw them flaunting themselves on white folds from every tower against the marvellous deep blue of the sky, he dressed contentedly, and taking one last look, went off to his work with a glory in his mind. It would have been difficult for the customers of Messrs. of Mergin and Chaytor to guess the precise ambition of Mr. Sladden as he walked before them in his neat frock coat. It was that he might be a man-at-arms or an archer, in order to fight for the little golden dragons that flew on a white flag for the unknown king in an inaccessible city. At first, Mr. Sladden used to walk round and round the mean street that he lived in, but he gained no clue from that, and soon he noticed that quite different winds blew below his wonderful window from those that blew on the other side of the house. In August the evenings began to grow shorter. This was the very remark that the other employees made to him at the Emporium, so that he almost feared that they suspected his secret. And he had much less time for the wonderful window, for lights were few down there, and they blinked out early. One morning late in August, just before he went to business, Mr. Sladden saw a company of pikemen running down the cobbled road towards the gateway of the medieval city. Golden Dragon City, he used to call it alone in his own mind, but he never spoke of it to anyone. The next thing that he noticed was that the archers were handling round bundles of arrows in addition to the quivers which they wore. Heads were thrust out of windows more than usual. A woman ran out and called some children indoors. A knight rode down the street, and then more pikemen appeared along the walls, and all the jackdaws were in the air. In the street no troubadour sang. Mr. Sladden took one look along the towers to see that the flags were flying, and all the golden dragons were streaming in the wind. Then he had to go to business. He took a bus back that evening and ran upstairs. Nothing seemed to be happening in Golden Dragon City, except a crowd in the cobbled streets that led down to the gateway. The archers seemed to be reclining as usual, lazily in their towers, and then a white flag went down with all its golden dragons. He did not see at first that all the archers were dead. The crowd was pouring towards him, towards the precipitous wall from which he looked. Men with a white flag covered with golden dragons were moving backwards, slowly. Men with another flag were pressing them, a flag on which there was one huge red bear. Another banner went down upon a tower. Then he saw it all. The golden dragons were being beaten, his little golden dragons. The men of the Bear were coming under the window. Whatever he threw from that height would fall with terrific force. Fire irons, coal, his clock, whatever he had, he would fight for his little golden dragons yet. A flame broke out from one of the towers and licked the feet of a reclining archer. He did not stir. And now the alien standard was out of sight directly underneath. Mr. Sladen broke the panes of the wonderful window and wrenched away with a poker the lead that held them. Just as the glass broke, he saw a banner covered with golden dragons, fluttering still. And then, as he drew back to hurl the poker, there came to him the scent of mysterious spices. And there was nothing there, not even the daylight, for behind the fragments of the wonderful window was nothing but that small cupboard in which he kept his tea things. And though Mr. Sladen is older now, and knows more of the world, and even has a business of his own, he has never been able to buy such another window, and has not ever since, either from books or men, heard any rumour at all of Golden Dragon City. End of chapter 14. Epilogue. Here the 14th episode of the Book of Wonder endeth, and here the relating of the chronicles of little adventures at the edge of the world. I take farewell of my readers, but it may be we shall even meet again, for it is still to be told how the gnomes robbed the fairies, and of the vengeance that the fairies took, and how even the gods themselves were troubled thereby in their sleep, and how the King of Ool insulted the troubadours, thinking himself safe among his scores of archers and hundreds of halberdiers, and how the troubadours stole to his towers by night, and under his battlements by the light of the moon made that king ridiculous for ever in song. But for this I must first return to the edge of the world. Behold, the caravans start. End of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The blows of his pickaxe were dulled in the deep walls. All night he worked. No sound came to molest him, and at dawn the last rock swerved and tumbled inwards, and the river poured in after. Then Alderic took a stone and went to the bottom step, and hurled the stone at the door. He heard the echoes roll into the tower. Then he ran back and dived through the hole in the wall. He was in the emerald cellar. There was no light in the lofty vault above him, but, diving through 20 feet of water, he felt the floor all rough with emeralds, and open coffers full of them. By a faint ray of the moon, he saw that the water was green with them, and easily filling a satchel, he rose again to the surface, and there were the Gibberlins, waist deep in the water, with torches in their hands. And without saying a word, or even smiling, they neatly hanged him on the outer wall, and the tale is one of those that have not a happy ending. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. How Nuth would have practised his art upon the knolls. Despite the advertisements of rival firms, it is probably that every tradesman knows that nobody in business at the present time has a position equal to that of Mr. Nuth. To those outside the magic circle of business, his name is scarcely known. He does not need to advertise. He is consummate. He is superior even to modern competition, and whatever claims they boast, his rivals know it. His terms are moderate. So much cash down when the goods are delivered, so much in blackmail afterwards. He consults your convenience. His skill may be counted upon. I have seen a shadow on a windy night move more noisily than Nuth, for Nuth is a burglar by trade. Men have been known to stay in country houses, and to send a dealer after mouth, nor rush upon the night breathing out fire. For well he knew the fate of those that did these things, but he consented to the terms imposed, and swore to the knight to become his trusty steed. It was on a saddle upon this dragon's back that Alderic afterwards sailed above the impassable forest, even above the tops of those measureless trees, children of wonder. But first he pondered that subtle plan of his, which was more profound than merely to avoid all that had been done before, and he commanded a blacksmith, and the blacksmith made him a pickaxe. Now there was great rejoicing at the rumour of Alderic's quest, for all folk knew that he was a cautious man, and they deemed that he would succeed and enrich the world, and they rubbed their hands in the cities at the thought of largesse, and there was joy among all men in Alderic's country, except perchance among the lenders of money, who feared they would soon be paid. And there was rejoicing also, because men hoped that when the Gibelins were robbed of their hoard, they would shatter their high-built bridge and break the golden chains that bound them to the world, and drift back, they and their tower, to the moon, from which they had come and to which they rightly belonged. There was little love for the Gibelins, though all men envied their hoard. So they all cheered that day when he mounted his dragon, as though he was already a conqueror, and what pleased them more than the good that they hoped he would do to the world was that he scattered gold as he rode away, for he would not need it, he said, if he found the Gibelins' hoard, and he would not need it more if he smoked on the Gibelins' table. When they heard that he had rejected the advice of those that gave it, some said that the knight was mad, and others said he was greater than those what gave the advice, but none appreciated the worth of his plan. He reasoned thus. For centuries men had been well advised and had gone by the cleverest way, while the Gibelins came to expect them to come by boat, and to look for them at the door whenever their larder was empty, even as a man looketh for a snipe in a marsh. But how, said Alderic, if a snipe should sit in the top of a tree, and would men find him there? Assuredly never. So Alderic decided to swim the river, and not to go by the door, but to pick his way into the tower through the stone. Moreover, it was in his mind to work below the level of the ocean, the river, as Homer knew, that girdles the world, so that as soon as he made a hole in the wall, the water should pour in, confounding the Gibelins and flooding the cellars, rumoured to be 20 feet in depth, and therein he would dive for emeralds, as a diver dives for pearls. And on the day that I tell of, he galloped away from his home, scattering largesse of gold, as I have said, and passed through many kingdoms, the dragon snapping at maidens as he went, but being unable to eat them because of the bit in his mouth, and earning no gentler reward than a spur thrust where he was softest. And so they came to the swart arboreal precipice of the unpassable forest. The dragon rose at it with a rattle of wings. Many a farmer near the edge of the world saw him up there where yet the twilight lingered, a faint black wavering line, and mistaking him for a row of geese going inland from the ocean, went into their houses cheerily rubbing their hands, and saying that winter was coming, and that we should soon have snow. Soon even there the twilight faded away, and when they descended at the edge of the world it was night, and the moon was shining. Ocean, the ancient river, narrow and shallow there, flowed by and made no murmur. Whether the Gibelins banqueted or whether they watched by the door, they also made no murmur, and Alderic dismounted and took his armour off, and saying one prayer to his lady, swam with his pickaxe. He did not part from his sword for fear that he meet with a Ghibelin. Landed the other side, he began to work at once, and all went well with him. Nothing put out its head from any window, and all were lighted so that nothing within could see him in the dark. Chapter 9 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The Horde of the Ghibelins. The Ghibelins eat, as is well known, nothing less good than man. Their evil tower is joined to terra cognita, to the lands we know, by a bridge. Their hoard is beyond reason. Avarice has no use for it. They have a separate cellar for emeralds and a separate cellar for sapphires. They have filled a hole with gold and dig it up when they need it. And the only use that is known for their ridiculous wealth is to attract to their larder a continual supply of food. In times of famine they have even been known to scatter rubies abroad, a little trail of them to some city of man, and sure enough their larders would soon be full again. Their tower stands on the other side of that river known to Homer, Horus Okeanoi, as he calls it, which surrounds the world. And where the river is narrow and fordable, the tower was built by the Ghibelins' gluttonous sires, for they like to see burglars rowing easily to their steps. Some nourishment that common soil has not the huge trees drained there with their colossal roots, from both banks of the river. There the Ghibelins lived, and discreditably fed. Alderic, Knight of the Order of the City and the Assault, hereditary guardian of the King's peace of mind, a man not unremembered among makers of myth, pondered so long upon the Ghibelins' hoard that by now he deemed it his. Alas, that I should say of so perilous a venture, undertaken at dead of night by a valorous man, that its motive was sheer avarice. Yet upon avarice only the Ghibelins relied to keep their larders full, and once in every 100 years sent spies into the cities of men to see how avarice did. And always the spies returned again to the tower, saying that all was well. It may be thought that as the years went on and men came by fearful ends on that tower's wall, fewer and fewer would come to the Ghibelins' table. But the Ghibelins found otherwise. Not in the folly and frivolity of his youth did Alderic come to the tower, but he studied carefully for several years the manner in which burglars met their doom when they went in search of the treasure that he considered his. In every case they had entered by the door. He consulted those who gave advice on this quest. He noted every detail and cheerfully paid their fees, and determined to do nothing that they advised, for what were their clients now? No more than examples of the savoury art, and mere half-forgotten memories of a meal, and many, perhaps, no longer even that. These were the requisites for the quest that these men used to advise: a horse, a boat, mail armour, and at least 3 men-at-arms. Some said, blow the horn at the tower door. Others said, do not touch it. Alderic thus decided he would take no horse down to the river's edge. He would not row along it in a boat, and he would go alone and by way of the forest unpassable. How pass, you may say, the unpassable? This was his plan. There was a dragon he knew of, who, if peasants' prayers are heeded, deserved to die. Not alone because of the number of maidens he cruelly slew, but because he was bad for the crops. He ravaged the very land and was the bane of a dukedom. Now Alderic determined to go up against him. So he took horse and spear and pricked till he met the dragon, and the dragon came out against him, breathing bitter smoke. And to him Alderic shouted, Hath foul dragon ever slain true knight?" And well the dragon knew that this had never been, and he hung his head and was silent, for he was glutted with blood. "Then," said the knight, "if thou wouldst ever taste maiden's blood again, thou shalt be my trusty steed, and if not, by this spear there shall befall thee all that the troubadours tell of the dooms of thy breed." And the dragon did not open his ravening